Hello, everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Daisy Jones and the Six Rewatch podcast. Now, when I speak, my topic is something I call Take the Doughnut, which is another way to say Carpe Diem. And it's all about going after the things that you want in life. And something that I wanted to do this year was rewatch the show Daisy Jones and the Six, but this time actually talk about it with other people and unpack it. And so here we are. And first of all, we did the deep dives, all 10 episodes. I've done a deep dive for those, but now we're doing the really fun part where I get to talk with people who worked on this show, cast and crew. So before I introduce my interview guest for today, a quick housekeeping item. If you are brand new to the show Daisy Jones and the Six, this may be a spoiler-filled conversation. We could mention any detail from any episode in the context of talking about the work that was done on this show. So just know that up front. If you haven't seen the whole show, maybe go back, binge it, and come back to this. But otherwise, so happy to have you here. I'm really excited to introduce my guest for today, who is Jess Kender, who is the production designer for this show. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk with you. I have a lot of questions to ask about your role, but I want to start where I start with everybody, which is how did you get connected to this show?
I was actually working with Hello Sunshine on Little Fires Everywhere, and it was our first week of shooting on Little Fires, and Lauren, the president of Hello Sunshine, came up to me and linked her arm into mine and said, "How do you feel about the 70s?" And that was the beginning of everything. And she got me the book. I read the book, and then we finished up Little Fires and jumped onto this one.
Oh, so good. So that networking is really important for what you do. So
Yes,
as a
I was very
production
lucky.
designer, tell us a bit about what your job entails. For those of us who don't have a lot of industry knowledge, how would you explain the work of a production designer?
So, what I say is, it is my job with the DP to create the look of the show. In an ideal world, um, a great production design is something where if you turned on the TV and you didn't see an actor cross in front of you, you would still know what show you were on. Obviously, that's not going to happen all the time, but ideally, you're creating this look of the show that's very distinct and unique that is part of the show's essence, essentially.
Okay, perfect. So when you're doing that job, when you think about like who you collaborate with most in terms of other members of probably the crew, who comes up for you as like people that you need to, you're on speed dial with these folks?
Huh. Everybody? Um, I think the job of a production designer, you're both working with above the line and below the line. So I'm in constant contact with the producers and the directors and the showrunners. And then also below me, I manage a bunch of different departments and then work in tandem with a bunch of other departments. So I manage the art department, I manage construction, I manage set deck, props, special effects, some visual effects, and then I work very closely also with post and grip and electric, and I'm constantly scouting and working with the DP. So I would say, as a production designer, you're working with everybody.
Oh my goodness. Okay, really complicated. So obviously you're going to have a ton of prep work for a job like this. When I understand that the timing of this particular job was unusual because we had COVID, but at what point are you brought on before the project begins?
Well, originally, before we knew COVID was coming, there was a 14-week prep, which is a very long prep for a TV show. Typically, I would say you run in the neighborhood of 10, 12 weeks, but they gave us 14 weeks. Then we shut down. Then we came back and had another 10 weeks. So in this case, I had 24 weeks of prep with a big, I did a whole other show in the middle of that prep.
Did you find with that gap, and especially with the work that you did you find that you were able to reuse a lot of the prep you had done in the first round? Or especially with COVID and restrictions that came from that, did you find that like you had to sort of scrap what you did and start over?
No, I think it was almost like this incredibly blissful situation if you take out the fact that we all thought, our world is collapsing. From a prep standpoint, almost everything we had already chosen about 80% of the locations that you see in the show. And when we came back, because COVID essentially put like a pause on life, most of those places were still available. So it was just a matter like all of our research was still pertinent. You know, it was the 70s, so it hasn't changed from when we shut down to when we came back. So all of the work we already did was just sort of sitting there waiting. And obviously, a few things had to change, you know, like a few things had shut down and schedules had shifted. But in general, it was almost like we had this wonderful prep. We had 14, we had been there for 10. Um, and then we had another 10. So I had 20 weeks of prep. It was almost like an extra 6 weeks were thrown in there, which was great because you could just develop things further. And honestly, it let the band, even though the band doesn't directly affect my work, it affects the show overall, and it let the band become so much more of a band. So it was exponentially better on that end as well.
Hmm. So when you get started with the prep on something like this, well, not something like this, where do you begin? Were there particular locations you were working on first? Where does it start for you?
Well, I mean, it definitely starts with the research. Every show starts with the research. So you start delving in as deeply as you can. And we knew there were going to be a couple like anchor points of the show, like Sound City was going to be a big one. So it was figuring out, are we going to build Sound City or are we going to shoot at the actual Sound City? But everything else starts from a place of, this is the research, this is the feel we want, and then we head out to find locations from there, with the exception of deciding what's going to be a build and what's going to be a location. And we knew this show was going to be primarily location based with a few key builds on set.
Okay. So, in terms of volume of sets and locations that you were dealing with, first of all, for those of us not in the industry, what are the practical considerations for you when working with a location versus a set? And what were you dealing with in terms of like just volume for this?
So we had I think over 220 sets and locations on this show. Um and
That sounds like a lot.
It is a
I
lot.
mean,
It is
yeah.
definitely a lot, especially when it's location based, because that means that when you shoot sets on stage, especially permanent sets, which are the ones that you see on shows where we come back to them again and again and again, it gives everybody a minute to sort of catch up because you're going back to a place that exists and you can get a little bit ahead. But when you're purely location based with the occasional set on stage, you're just constantly running, gunning, running, gunning. And some days we were shooting, you know, 2 or 3 locations a day. Um, so you sort of, for the most part, unless there's something that is a very specific trick to a set, budget is honestly what determines whether you're going to shoot it location or a set on stage. So let's say there's something like a set that's super small, like a jail cell, for example. If you have a lot of pages in a jail cell, it's not going to make sense to shoot in there. It's going to be too small. You're not going to get the angles you want. You could also afford to build it. But there are specific sets that when you read through a script, you can be like, oh, we have to build that because the script demands it for some reason or another. It might be too small. It might be that there's a shot that, you know, you want to get a crane overhead and look down and move. But for the sort of general mix of set, it comes down to, will it cost more to shoot on location or will it cost more to shoot on stage? Because both have their benefits and their negatives. You know, you'll get a lot more depth in a smaller set if you shoot on location because you'll just have what that gives you. But it's also the cost of sending an entire crew out where they could have just been sitting on stage and there's no cost of trucks and there's no cost of movement and there's no time lost in moving around a permanent set. So if you've been doing the job a while, you can go through and you can kind of base on page count or importance, you know what's going to be a set and what's going to be a location.
Hmm. So I will ask questions about specific spaces we see in the show, but as a sort of a broad question, when you think back on the work you did on this show, what do you think of as the most complex set or location, and what do you think of as the most straightforward, if that's such a thing?
So I think most complex is easy. That's Sound City. We actually had gone through the process of drawing up a full set of plans for this set. And this is one of the few exceptions to what I just said right there, where is it more cost efficient to shoot it on stage or to shoot it on location? One of our directors of the two blocks is Nzinga, and she came from music videos, is where she got her start. And she was a really firm believer that in Sound City, essentially the history and the essence of the space was going to have an effect on the performances that would come out there. So kind of down to the wire, we made the decision that we were actually going to shoot in Sound City. However, Sound City had been totally redone. So we had to essentially figure out how to build a set within Sound City. So one of the things that was there was still like the mixing board was original and a few of the walls in the big area where they record. And that was it. So, like, the lobby was totally stripped out. It had raw concrete floors, it had exposed piping, it was all white. And we couldn't even just come in and just paint the walls because we needed it to look the way it was, which was a bunch of offices, and they had made it an open ground plan. But then we had the problem of on stage, you can rig ceilings off of what we call the perms. Like you have ways where you can stand set walls by, you know, essentially putting them into the floor because the floors of sound stages are meant for that. When you come into a location, none of that exists. So how do we support a ceiling when we have nothing to support a ceiling on? So it actually became a much bigger deal to shoot on location because we essentially rebuilt the location on location. Um, and then I would say for least complex, when you're doing a period film, I don't know that that actually exists anymore because unless you are in like a museum, nothing is period correct. So no matter where we are, we're going to have to touch it. So there are some locations you touch less, but for the most part, when you do a period piece, everything involves a lot of thought. You might find the perfect house that is preserved in its architecture, but all of the set dressing is wrong. So all of that needs to come out. Or maybe they refit it with, modern fixtures, stuff like that. So I would almost say because even like a walk and talk that you would do if you're doing a contemporary piece where you're like, okay, they're walking, talking, and maybe we want a hero car, but in this case, if they're walking and talking, all the cars have to be changed on the street. Like all the signage needs to be changed, all the parking meters need to be changed out. So there isn't anything that's just an as is when it's a period piece.
So interesting. Well, I want to pause for a second here just to tell the audience that I had seen an interview that you and Lisa Clark, the set decorator, did together that I
Mhm.
thought was really good, really comprehensive, really detailed about particular spaces. I'm going to link the video in the description here as well because I'd like to consider this sort of a companion to that. Inherently, I think there are a couple of sets or locations that we will touch upon here as well, but it's one of the reasons why I want to try to branch out into some things you didn't talk about there. But in that interview, you all talked about the Laurel Canyon House, Teddy Price's home and office, a little bit about Sound City. Um, One thing that you did talk about a little bit in that interview, but I wanted to delve into that a bit more here as well, is that, given that Daisy starts in Los Angeles and then the Dunn brothers move out there, the Sunset Strip is going to be an important part of this show. So what can you tell us about bringing Sunset Strip or specific clubs on it to life for this time period?
Well, I think what was interesting and what actually makes me a little sad now is that um, for the most part, the facades that we used, we ended up using only one block of the Sunset. Well, I suppose like a block and a half. So it was from the Whiskey A Go Go down to the Viper Room, which was Filthy McNasty's. And we really only used one side and then the intersection. And the stuff on the one side we were really featuring had a lot of the same facades. They had just been changed. So, like, the front of what was Filthy's used to have a bunch of like the raw stone, and the Viper Room had painted it all black, you know? And so we painted it back to what it was. You know, there is a little um corner store that was very similar to what it's been. And now when I drive by it, it's been sold and it's no longer the same as it used to be, which makes me a little bit sad. But we could go along, and there was this person who photographed the Sunset Strip back in the 60s, photographed it again, I think in like 63. I'm not sure I have the years right, but photoed it a couple times. And so we had all this great reference to compare, but it was just a matter of like, let's get the signage right. Okay, this facade got stuccoed over, but it used to be shiplap. Let's put shiplap up. It was not, it was essentially another version of building a set in a set, but easier than Sound City because the existing bones were the same.
Okay. Well, another space that I just love to see on screen, any episode where we get it, is Billy and Camilla's house that they rent after the royalty start checks start coming in. I just find it such an interesting place, both inside and out. The balcony area looking onto the floor below, it really comes alive, and that scene where they're singing "Ooh La La." The terraced backyard looks somehow different to me and really complex in like every scene it plays in. Even like we get a fire pit at one point that lights the scene in a certain way. We get some really nice night scenes out there. So I'm sure there's a lot to consider when using this location, especially when it plays in so much in so many important moments. First of all, what made it right for the show? What was right about this?
Well, I mean, what was amazing is the guy who lives there loves the 70s. So he had taken that space and essentially already, what's the right word? He didn't update it, but he brought all the finishes back to what they would have been in the 70s. So we walked in and you had this place that had been not only preserved, but like upkept in a way that felt incredibly authentic because he had this love for it. Now, it was a super hard location to get to, but it was one of those where when we came up to it, both me and the DP and the director were like, this is totally right. But it had all these like tricks that we had to do where like had this big fence and we took out a picture of a piece of the fence so we could get this great shot that like took them outside and up, you know. Everyone knew it would be hard to shoot there because they're essentially not even stairs going down to that lower living room. It's sort of like a modified ladder almost. But everyone was like, it's so good. We have to stay here. And it didn't actually, number one, it was not a huge space, so it couldn't be asking too much from set deck. Already, I mean, everyone had to hand carry and bring stuff up there, but there was only so much you could fill. And the owner hadn't done anything that we needed to take away besides the fact that he had gotten like essentially a Smeg fridge instead of like a truly like who wants a fridge from the 70s for real. He got, you know, a clear reproduction. But it was a matter of just bringing in their personalities, but we weren't fighting anything because he had done such a good job of maintaining it that way. You know, like maybe in the back we took down a couple, you know, non-period lights, but in general he had such an affinity that it was almost like a gift to find that location.
So good. Well, another space that I'm interested to know more about is Chateau Marmont. We start seeing it play in episode 4, I believe. It's going to come up in a lot of scenes, different angles of Daisy's room. We're going to get her front door. We're going to get a pool area. We're going to get an establishing shot of it, I believe. There are like so many ways that this little mini world is included in the show, and it always somehow feels different to me. Like I always have to remind myself, like this is just where Daisy's staying. With the pool, uh, it also, I don't know if this was intentional, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Almost Famous scene where we get a couple characters going to a house party, and there's a pool that plays in that too. So I'm just curious, like with all of the different ways we get the Chateau Marmont in this show, what was it like bringing this to screen for you?
Well, I think we actually scouted the actual chateau at first because we were thinking about shooting there, but it didn't actually provide what we needed it to provide. Um, so we knew that the basis needed to be the pool because the scene where she's floating in that beautiful wardrobe, like, was so key in the book, and it was going to be pivotal. Like, I think when you do a book to series translation, there are certain moments that you know that the audience is going to want to see, and that was definitely one of them. So we needed to find the pool, and the location that we picked actually used to be an estate that then was broken into apartments. So it was an estate that was based around this pool, but then had apartments which worked perfectly for Marmont because that's what Marmont is, a bunch of essentially little of apartments that are around the pool. Um, and it felt incredibly LA because it had all of the, different palm trees and the plants that were right. But the big key was the pool. It was only missing one thing, which was it was missing a diving board. And, like she has to be on the diving board and roll off into the pool to get that hero scene. So our sort of biggest challenge with the space was figuring out how do we put in a diving board when we're not allowed to drill into the concrete or do anything to the location that will hold, even though she's a tiny actress, an actress who's going to be moving on it and rolling off of it, and make it look like it belongs there. And once we figured that out, that location was a lock because it had so much depth. And we shot in one of the people's apartments, like the rest of the people were willing to allow us to play there all the days we needed to be there. And it was great.
Wow. Okay. What an interesting tidbit with the diving board because it's certainly important. Like that's a pivotal, it's a really memorable scene. I think it gives us so many images that last. But if that's like the linchpin of the whole
Yeah.
operation, sounds really tricky. Episode 7 is sort of a spin-off within the show. We go to Greece. Which in the show, Simone's not sure how to pronounce the name of the island. I think it's Ethra, but I've been
Hydra.
looking Hydra.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're gonna get this whole experience that we get with Daisy and Nikki and Simone and Bernie in Greece, uh, but just for one episode. So talk to me about what this was like trying to bring the show to Greece.
Well, I would say probably the trickiest thing for me was the fact that, it takes like 18 hours to get to Greece. And at the time that we started prepping Greece, we were working in LA, we were working in New Orleans, and I was flying to Greece. And I actually ended up going back and forth a total of 4 times because we came out and scouted initially just a tiny group of us to make sure that shooting on Hydra was a possibility because there are no cars there. Well, there's one car. It's like the dump truck. They use it for funerals. Like it's super minimal. So they move all their stuff by mules, and it's a 2.5 hour ferry ride from Athens, or it's a 3 hour drive with a 20-minute water taxi. So we had to make sure that it was even feasible to use as a shooting location for a company our size. Um, and then once we realized it was, we went back and we scouted for all our locations. And then we lost Daisy's house. So I had to go back for a third time to rescout for Daisy's house. And then the final trip was when we went over and shot there. But I think it was a mix of being able to figure out how do you shoot when you can only use mules and also being able to communicate back and forth with all the Greeks. There's a massive time difference, like there's a whole bunch of things going on. How are you going to get a period piece done when you are so far away and running so run and gun? And then there was the added level that because the other storyline is Simone in New York, we had to essentially we shot New Orleans exteriors for exterior Manhattan and Athens interior clubs for interior Manhattan. So we did, it always makes me laugh. We did Athens for New Orleans for New York.
Amazing. And it works for me in the show. I mean, if not for having these conversations, I would not know that that was what you were doing. So it's amazing. And I also can't help but think, you go to this island in Greece, you're operating by mule, and you still have to match the time period there. How challenging was that? Or, have they evolved as much even from in that time period as maybe a city like LA would have?
I think what was really great about Hydra when we realized when we got there is because there are no cars there, one of the biggest challenges that you have isn't there because you don't have the infrastructure to really uber modernize a place. And I think Hydra is very much a tourist economy and they know what people are coming for. They like the feel, people like the feel of that town. So it remains pretty unchanged. Like the houses that were built in the 70s are still there. They're from the 1900s. The biggest thing we had to fight on was the giant cruise ships that would come up. So we had to, when we were shooting in the marina, we had to make sure we were not shooting at a big cruise ship drop off time. But for the most part, you have all these cute little shops with awnings that work for any time, like even the signage, they sort of take care to keep it within the language of the island, which is not updated. So you have a lot of still hand painted signs. You'll still have some printed things that don't fit, but for the most part, you have this economy that's based on being timeless and it felt that way. And then what was interesting is to like dress the spaces because obviously, some of the spaces either had been updated on the inside or just didn't fit what we needed. Like the house that we shot where Daisy lived, the room that you see as her living room was actually their master bedroom. And so we had to fully change that out. But because you have this island that's sort of timeless, we were able to both get stuff from the island that fit into the time period. And then Athens had just a plethora of 70s pieces at flea markets and, just my set decorator, supervising art director, she was great. And she just went out and she was like, the amount of stuff I can pull is amazing. Like I remember walking through our warehouse the first time and being like, we have so many options. And they were all in decent condition because Athens, even though it's a modern city, still has a lot from the 70s that exists within its ether of today.
So interesting. And in a previous answer, you had started to touch on New York. And I wanted to come back to that and just see, when you're building out Simone and Bernie's disco scene world, what were some of the considerations for you, especially given that you were doing this in multiple different cities?
Well, I will say one of the things that sort of was a realization for me, makes total sense, but was a surprise, was that there is no brick in Athens. They don't use brick. Like everything is sort of marble. And so much of Manhattan is brick. So it was a mix of like, for me, texturally, creating fake brick and also sort of the translation that happened with talking to the Greeks over there. One of the things, there was a very specific sort of style of brick you see in Manhattan, but they were doing online research and they were like, we found it. And what they found was sort of like 50 stacked brick. And I was like, no, no, that's not the brick that's there. And they were like, no, no, no. Like we found the research. And I was like, no, that exists, but that's not right. So there were funny little things like that would happen where I'd be like, oh, it doesn't exist here. So like they don't know that. But we were lucky in that the way that we sort of set it up was that we were doing interior clubs and the interior clubs are not so different, no matter where you are. Um, One of the things I found the most fun was doing the roller disco, which you don't see a ton of, but was a blast to shoot because we were in like this club 2 stories down that had been full with loungy furniture. But I was like, I bet if we pull this all out, we'll be able to have something the size of a roller rink. And so like getting out there and finally watching all these 70s people roller rinking around, like I was born in 76, so I'm a little bit too young, to truly have been there. But like, I remember what it looked like seeing people at a roller disco. And that day where we were on set watching them skate around was phenomenal. And so Athens it's a metropolitan city. So finding a big loft space, for Simone to get up on stage and sing at, not that difficult, like finding the interiors was not a challenge, but the exteriors that's where we did a lot of our brick facades because the exteriors look nothing like Manhattan and we would need the entrances. So while we do our big wides in New Orleans, we'd need something to sort of go inside on in Athens, and we did a lot of changing of stuff there. So honestly, that wasn't as hard as one would think. I would say doing her apartment was tricky because we ended up where we realized we could not build where she's cutting a record. That ended up being a build that was within a club we were actually shooting. There was a whole strip of clubs on one road, so we shot in like one club and we built a set in another club because we just couldn't find that set up in the way that we wanted it. But the rest of the interior spaces were pretty flexible.
Oh, this is so fascinating. I think it goes to show everybody just how much work goes into this. Another thing that I imagine that I'm getting a sense was a huge project was the tour buses. We've got two. We've got Billy and Daisy's tour buses that look a little different to me. And what should we know from a production design standpoint about making these buses happen?
Those were quite a challenge and but super fun. Like those are some of my favorite things we did on the show. Um, there is this sort of bus graveyard that exists about a little bit over an hour outside of LA. And I went out there one day and I knew they had two Greyhounds, and they were like just the Greyhounds, standard Greyhound bus that you would pick up and take from one city to another. And they were willing to let us do whatever we wanted with them. And so I scouted the Greyhounds. Like they even had like a little bathroom in the back. Um, we got them and essentially stripped them all out with the exception of saving the seats because in the front of the buses, we wanted some seats and built our sets within there. So there are little tricks like with all the bunks, the bunks flip up so you can fit camera in. We integrated all the lighting in so that it was going to be such a small space. The ways that you could typically light a set wouldn't exist there. So we had to really work with lighting to make sure that they were able to light practically with what we were doing. Um, and we sort of wanted to have the two buses, not sort of, we wanted to have the two buses like Daisy's was the party bus and Billy's was the serious sober bus. And so we had the fun of sort of playing around with like tighter patterns for Billy, the more structured feeling, and Daisy's was a little bit more like slightly Moroccan, very like sexy velvets and deeper colors in there. But what was great is because we decided to shoot it practically, when the band walked through it for the first time, like it felt very real because it was, they were really working within those constraints. And then, those buses got driven to New Orleans so they could shoot there. I actually found out they used those buses on another feature later on because it just happened. My set designer who designed up the inside of the buses, Leah, worked on the show that used them again and did some minor modifications because it was another period piece. So that was exciting to think that our buses live on.
Yeah, they continue. The
Yeah.
lore continues about the buses. One space that I really want to talk about, we don't see a ton of it, but in episode 9, we get Daisy Jones and the Six goes to Pittsburgh, and we're going to see Marlene Dunn's house, which Graham, or maybe both Graham and Bill, I assume both Graham and Billy bought for her with
Yeah.
all the money they've been making. So it's the house is huge. We get a line, it's not really a throwaway line, but we get a line that like it's in a part of town they couldn't even visit when they were little. Um, and so now it's a symbol of the success of this band. And we get to see the backyard, we get to see bedrooms, we get to see maybe a covered porch or a sunroom. I don't know what you would call
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Um, I mean, it's beautiful. It shows you right away that Marlene's station in life has changed. What can you tell us about this house?
Well, we shot it actually in New Orleans, but we were looking for sort of the quintessential Americana that shows you've made it. So, something that is the house that everybody can relate to and get those feelings that you were talking about. So we didn't think that she would pick something that would be uber modern in the 70s or, something that is super dated. We wanted to get her something that felt like she had moved up in the world but was still approachable, like was still the warm person that her kids remembered and now exists, but in a much bigger space. What I found most interesting about that house was while the house itself drove some of the story, the backyard was critical because Nzinga, who directed those scenes as well, really wanted to do a oneer within the whole backyard party. And so the way the backyard was set up to have them come out, chat with each other, move by the pool, move around the back, have different people over here having a conversation while we're seeing these people in the foreground. And so when we walked that backyard, and Zinga was like, I can see it. I can see how we can do this here because it was large enough that uh she could get everything in the oneer that she wanted. I do think one of the things that's sort of funny about that backyard is it turns out that so I was born in Pittsburgh and I actually went to college in Pittsburgh, so very familiar with Pittsburgh. In the South, or at least I shouldn't say in the South, in the New Orleans area, a lot of the pools have these sort of covered areas that sit by them. They have a fully hard ceiling. They have legs that come down and there'll be like a built-in grill and there'll be seating. That doesn't exist really in the East Coast and certainly didn't exist in the 70s. So we had this huge structure that was totally wrong that we ended up cladding to look like kind of a garage in the back because it was so unique to this area of the country where another area of the country wouldn't have it at all.
Oh, this is so interesting. It's a space that may not register for people as much because we get it in episode 9 and there's so much happening in the story at that point. But I think it actually all the choices that you all made tell a big story about where this band has gone to through like how they've treated Marlene. And so it's amazing. I know you've done, your share of interviews about this show, and I just wanted to ask, are there any specific sets or locations that you wanted to say something about that you maybe haven't gotten a chance to say something about?
Hmm. I mean, I always have my babies, and I don't think that changes from interview to interview. Like probably my favorite set on the show is Elamar, because it's just sort of my type of set. I do think that the Miami hotel rooms, my supervising art director, Brian, actually designed them, and seeing him have a have his run at what the world was. We developed the world together. Like the entire art department, set deck, construction, we all developed it together. But for the most part, the final word comes down from sort of, I wouldn't say final. The initial word comes from me. And when it came to Miami, he had expressed an interest in taking the reins on something, and it was fun to see what he came up with within the vernacular of our show. And I don't think people know that. And I thought what he came up with was very exciting and interesting, and we had to do a quick change from Billy's hotel room to Daisy's hotel room, and he found these great wallpapers that related to each other but were very different colors. So it was immediately clear we were in a different space. That was fun for me, only in that it's not the typical way we do a set. And it was fun to see how someone else came up with the language in the set. I would say another thing that was very fun for me was in the Saturday Night Live back room where they're all hanging out while they're waiting before, they have to run out because, they have the tragedy. There is this board that's set up that was meant to look like almost the skits board where they would put up what skits were happening each night. And what Set Deck had done on that board was they had put up essentially inside jokes about stuff that had happened on the show. And so if you went up, there were different things that if you were on the show, I don't think anyone who would, if you froze frame on it and you came up close, you wouldn't understand that. But for those of us who are all on the show, you would get the stuff that was up there. And it was very funny. Like it referenced, some hurricanes we had that almost shut stuff down. It referenced just inside jokes with Set Deck. That was a delight.
That is so special that it gets
Yeah.
sort of immortalized and you like it's an inside joke within an inside joke, which is
Yeah.
the best thing on the planet. Um, you've worked on so many projects, you worked on other shows and movies. What stands out to you as different in the process of making Daisy Jones and the Six?
Well, I mean, this was my first very location heavy base show. All my other shows have had permanent sets we went back to. So going through the process of just constantly being on location made it very different. I also think one of the things that was very, very exciting to me was that while everything we do becomes something, and it's something that everybody can access. I got into this business, and one of the things that's the most exciting is my grandma didn't drive, and she could like turn on the TV and see my work, like. So we make these things that are out there for everybody, but we don't make stuff that you can hold so much. And on Daisy, we made that album, and the art department designed that album cover. And that album I now have framed on my wall. It's something that I can like touch and hold, and we did that. And that is very cool. Like there's all this merchandising and stuff, but it's not the same. We didn't do the merchandising for the show. Maybe we did the logo, but that album cover like we did like we designed the shot, we designed the logos, and that is very, very cool.
Hmm. Oh, so good. Well, you are probably too young for this question, but I mean, nostalgia is going to be a factor whenever we deal with a period piece, especially, I don't know if who this would be a contemporary period piece, because so many people have lived through this time period. So, for you, were there any particular elements that were nostalgic for you?
Well, I would say that sort of some of the colors and textures actually remind me of the grandma I was just talking about. She had a house that she updated in the 70s, maybe even a little earlier before that. And she sort of kept it that way. So it had like orange sculpted carpeting that I can remember sitting on from when I was a kid till when I had my own kids. It had some of the sculpted artwork on the wall, like it had wood spindles in the kitchen. And so there are a lot of elements in some of the more domestic sets that remind me of my grandma. So I
Hmm.
have the nostalgia there. And then I also feel like, I mean, you can tell little, I have dead straight hair. So I always felt like I was meant to be in the 70s. Like my hair, like I was a kid of the 80s and tried to spray it up like this and it would never stay. So anytime I look at the 70s, I always think I should have been dressed like that. I love a bell bottom. Like that type of thing is the other part of the 70s that always sort of calls to me.
Hmm. Well, one other thing I wanted to ask about here, there's so many, you worked with everybody, right? There's so many unsung heroes that work on a project like this. Who deserves a shout out? Or I am sure everybody deserves a shout out, but who do you especially want to shout out that maybe you didn't get to mention so far in this interview?
It's so funny because really, like, you are only as good as your team, right? So everyone on the team deserves a shout out. But I will customize this just to say there is a department we have that's called craft service. And craft service provides all the food on set. Not the catering, not the breakfast and dinner and lunch, but like on set, all your great snacks. I'm gonna give craft service a shout out because I love those snacks on set.
That's so good. Can I tell you, I've done however many interviews I've done for Daisy Jones and the Six, and I've done interviews for the show Halt and Catch Fire, and you're the first person who has ever shouted out craft service. And I feel like that's something I would most appreciate on
Yep,
set.
I love to eat.
Like I see you, Jess. It's
Thank
okay.
you.
I don't even know how to phrase this last question because it's been such a strange last several years in your industry, but are there any projects that you want to plug here? And it could be things coming up or things that are recent or long past, whatever comes up for you. But are there any things you want to make sure that we all check out?
Well, I will say I just ended about a month ago um the show The Last Thing He Told Me. Season one came out. It's with Hello Sunshine again. So if you love Hello Sunshine work like Daisy Jones, um, it's going to be a great season. We went to Paris, which was fantastic. Um, and second to that, I did the LA unit of Elle, which is the Legally Blonde prequel.
Oh,
And for those of us who are like Gen X, well, really, so many people love Legally Blonde. I can say that this prequel is everything that you loved about Legally Blonde in a way that's very relatable, but different enough to be interesting. So I will certainly be tuning into both of those.
thank you for making those suggestions. Everybody be sure to check those out. And thank you so much for taking all this time, Jess, and talking with me about the work that you did on this show. I mean, it's just incredible the way you all put us into this time period, and the volume of sets and locations you were dealing with is staggering to me. So I appreciate you taking some time to unpack it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And for everybody who is watching this, go out there. Don't be the muse, be the somebody. Bye, everyone.